Good evening. Our exclusive interview is about Kemalist Turkey and Middle East. Our guest is Dr. Amit Bain from Clemson University. He's an associate professor of Middle East history. Welcome to Mediascope, Mr. Bain.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Your book is very good, and it's about Kemalist Turkey and Middle East relations. Why did you choose this subject? Why did you write about it?
Well, when I was working on my previous book, which focused on Ottoman ulema in the last years of the empire and the early years of the republic, one of the focuses of my research was one of the late Sheikhul Islam, Mustafa Sabri Effendi, who had to go on exile after the establishment already before the establishment of the Turkish Republic, after the Kemalists took over Istanbul. And he spent many years in Egypt. And I was surprised to see, having read for so many years that Turkey disengaged from the Middle East after the establishment of the Republic, how well it was actually connected to people in Egypt, issues that he had to deal with in Egypt. So this was one instance in which I felt that perhaps we don't have the whole story about Turkey's presence in the Middle East after the establishment of the Republic. And then when I was thinking about my next project, this was a period around 2010, 2011, in which Turkey became very, very involved in Middle Eastern affairs, in current Middle Eastern affairs. And I've noticed that oftentimes when journalists or op-ed writers, many other people commented on present-day Turkey's engagement with the Middle East, it was often juxtaposed, often seen as opposed to the claimed disengagement of Turkey from the Middle East under the early republic, under the government of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. So I thought that I have a good sense from my earlier work that this was not the case, and that since there is an interest in the types of engagement, perhaps a correction is in place, and perhaps it is worthwhile to revisit the issue and perhaps reframe not only what we know about that period, about the period under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, but also how we look at today in light of again, reframing of the situation under the early republic. So basically, both certain hunches from knowing the history then, but also present-day interest in the current situation of Turkey's engagement with the Middle East, informed my decision to take on that topic.
Okay, let's start to talk with the relations of Kemalist Republic with the neighbors. So the relations were complicated with Syria, Iraq, and Iran especially. If you want, let's start with Iraq. It was under the mandate of Great Britain at first. How were the relations in the beginning till the independence?
Well, with all its neighbors, when Kemalist Turkey, and when I'm saying Kemalist Turkey, I'm talking about Turkey under Mustafa Kemal, not you know, later periods. Some people talk about Kemalist Turkey, obviously for many more decades under the self-described Kemalist elite. But I'm talking about the period really under Mustafa Kemal, in the period between the two world wars. And when Turkey looked at the Middle East, it was an area of challenges, threats, but also of opportunities. And in the case of Iraq in particular, the situation, the relations began on a very bad note because of the disagreements on the border. Turkey demanded to be handed control over what became northern Iraq, the area of Mosul and the Kurdish-dominated regions to its east. This was a period that the National Pact, the Misak al-Milli, defined as by right part of Turkey. These were regions that at the time of the armistice in 1918, the British Army was not yet in occupation of them, so they were occupied after the armistice. And Turkey basically argued that on the basis of history, geography, cultural ties, these regions, again, mostly Kurdish dominated, but also the area of Mosul, should by right belong to Turkey. And this became a very difficult issue between Turkey and Iraq and Turkey and Great Britain. Even at the time of the signing of the Lausanne Agreement, this could not be solved. So it took actually 3 more years until 1926, when the border was finalized after many negotiations, disagreements, and arbitration. And Turkey did not get what it wanted. Iraq, and obviously the British government backing it, got most of its demand, with the exception of the region of Hakkari. Hakkari was a region that Britain wanted also to be part of Iraq, so Turkey got that. But the more valuable regions to the south, oil-rich, and again, Kurdish regions to the south, remained part of Iraq. So it began on a very bad note. Now, add to this the fact that the new king in Baghdad was Faisal, who led the Arab revolt during World War I, or at least led the army of the Arab revolt. His father was a leader. So it began on a bad note. But once Iraq moved towards receiving formal independence in 1932, the process was really 1930, but Iraq gets its formal independence in 1932. There is an effort there, both from the Iraqi side and from the Turkish side, to normalize the situation, to normalize the relations. This involves a visit of King Faisal to Turkey in 1931, at the time described as a very historic visit. Remember, the former leader of the armies Arab revolt now coming to Turkey, accepted with a lot of honor, meeting Prime Minister Inonu, President Mustafa Kemal. So it was seen as a new development, but even though the relations improved, they remain tension-filled. Why? For one reason, the Turkish government continued to suspect Faisal of all kinds of designs that it was opposed to. For example, Faisal wanted to unite Syria and Iraq under his throne, and Turkey was very much opposed to it. So when it appeared that Faisal was taking steps towards perhaps creating the infrastructure for unification, Turkey actively tried to prevent it. It did not want to see a unified Arab country south of its borders, a country that might lay claim to Turkish territories in Anatolia. So it actively tried to prevent it. On the other hand, there were instances of security cooperation against Kurdish insurgents in their border regions, in the common border region of Iraq and Turkey. This was a complicated thing. Sometimes, actually, there was support from Iraq to Kurdish insurgencies in Anatolia, and sometimes various levels of support from Turkey to Kurdish insurgencies inside Iraq. But for the most part, both sides were opposed to any Kurdish autonomy or let alone independence in their common border region. So they united on that. Both of them were opposed to efforts, short-lived efforts, but still efforts of the Assyrian minority to establish autonomy in northern Iraq near the borders with them. And beyond these security considerations that both created sometimes tensions, but also some instances of cooperation, it was also an issue of possible economic cooperation, which Turkey really pushed forward in the latter part of the 1930s. Turkey wanted to establish direct transportation links to Iraq in the hope of taking advantage of the developing oil industry in Iraq. Hope that much of Iraqi transportation will flow through Turkey to Europe, that it will be a transit route through Turkey to Europe, that perhaps some of the Iraqi oil will flow to Europe through Turkey. So there were also economic considerations. So it's a mixed bag in these relations. On the eve of World War II, it appears that that the relations are improving, especially after in 1937 Iraq joins Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan in the so-called Sadabad Pact, pact of
non-aggression,
mutual defense and non-aggression. So it appeared that things are getting better between them, but still there were sometimes suspicions going on. So it's a mixed bag, but certainly not a situation in which Turkey and Iraq are fully hostile or disengaging from each other or anything like that.
When we look at the relations of Kemalist Turkey with Middle Eastern neighbors, we see that Turkey managed to normalize the relations with Iraq and Iran, but when we look at Syria, the problem always goes on. Why do you think it is like that?
Well, to begin with, the border with Syria is very different than with Iraq and Iran. In Iraq and Iran, the border regions were areas that perhaps were perhaps they were there kind of. I mean, these were rugged mountainous areas with Iraq and Iran. That perhaps you had their migration routes of nomadic tribes, but this was kind of a frontier region, even in Ottoman times. In the case of Syria, it's very different. The border runs through areas that were very well integrated, areas north and south of the new border, sometimes through fields, sometimes through settlements. So the border there is really cutting through communities. And in that case, there was also a lot of suspicions from both sides, both the Syrian side and the Turkish side. The Turkish side, Syria maintained demand to areas north of the borders, areas that had a lot of ethnic Arab populations like Urfa, Gaziantep, even Mersin. So areas to the north that at the time of short-lived Arab independence in Turkey in 1918, 1920, the Arab nationalists in Syria laid claim to these territories. And on the other hand, the Arab nationalists in Syria suspected that Turkey did not really retreated from its demands in the National Pact, in the Misaki-Milli, to territories that were now parts of northern Syria, like what became known as Hatay, the Skenderun area, Alexandretta in English, and areas in just south of the borders, even Aleppo itself. So there was this concern. And the fact that the French government, the French mandatory authorities played a complicated game of divide and rule inside Syria, appeared to at times be willing to contemplate making radical changes in Syria, appeared to suggest that it might be willing to reach a deal with the Turkish government at a certain point to transfer some Syrian territories to Turkey. And we know that it happened in the late 1930s, that Hatay was eventually, in 1938, given supposed independence, 1939, annexed to Turkey. But if you look at the Syrian press, Syrian publications, already in the late 1920s, there are all the times rumors, time and again, that France might transfer this region to Turkey. So it created a tension-filled relations between two sides in an area that, again, in contrast to the situation with the new border with Iraq and Iran that cuts through rugged, mountainous regions. In the case of Turkey, it was a more integrated region that was now divided between Turkey and Syria. So, because of the insecurities of the Syrian nationalists, as a result of the French maneuvering there, the levels of distrust, the level of suspicion, the level of fear from Turkey on the one hand, and in Turkey, the level of concern that revolts in eastern Anatolia, like the Mount Ararat revolt in the early 1930s, or the Dersim revolt in the late 1930s, were supported from Syria, created a situation in which, even though they did try to negotiate, these negotiations stumbled, didn't lead to any successful results. But there were efforts in negotiations. At a certain point in the late 1930s, there was an informal representative of the Syrian government in Ankara, Adil Arslan. So he's this Druze prince, very respected Syrian leader at the time, located in Ankara in an effort to negotiate. Syrian leaders traveled to Ankara to try to reach certain agreements with the Turkish government. But at the end of the day, it didn't work out because of the territorial dispute and the sense in Syria that the French government was selling them short, where it was giving their territory, and the sense in Turkey that in northern Syria there is a basis of support for revolts inside Anatolia in order to break up Turkey. So this situation created really the highest level of disagreement, the highest level of tension, the lowest level of cooperation with any other country in the Middle East.
In your book, you are telling the fear of Turkish Republic from the construction of a big and powerful Arabic country in the neighbors, or unification of Iraq and Syria, etc. Is that one of the reasons that Reza Shah and Atatürk have good relations?
Well, there were all kinds of reasons why Turkey developed relations with Iran and vice versa. There were, even though these relations, in contrast to what you often find in the history books, as if it's kind of idyllic relations, great relations. I mean, there were some, and I talk about it in the book. There were some suspicions there too. Between these two countries, and there was also territorial dispute between Turkey and Iran too. But eventually, they established pretty good relations, Turkey and Iran, in the 30s, and they do share discomfort with any notion of Arab unity, a larger Arab structure that includes Syria and Iraq. But it was a greater concern for Turkey than to Iran. I mean, it was a concern for Iran, but it was greater Turkey, and Turkey was also in a better position to try to disrupt it. I mean, when we talk about the period between the two world wars, it's very different than today. Today, Iran has a lot of assets in Syria, Lebanon, these areas. It can influence outcomes there. But that was not the case in the period between the two world wars. Iran had very little influence, definitely in Syria, very little influence. Turkey had much more influence. It was only recently dislodged from Syria after World War I. It had more leeway, better ability to pressure France than Iran had. So it was a much bigger deal for Turkey than for Iran. Iran issues with Iraq, but not so much with Syria, with the French control there. So this was perhaps one reason, but there were other reasons for Turkey to want to establish close relations or better relations with Iran, and there were economic reasons for that too. Turkey tried to, similarly way with Iraq, it hoped to establish transportation ties to Iran to become the major, or a major at least, transit route for Iranian trade with Europe. So for that, it hoped to develop the Tabriz-Trabzon road. So that road that will lead to a newly built port in Trabzon. They hope that this will help connect through the Black Sea to Romania, and from there to Germany. They hope to establish a railway line from Diyarbakir to the Iranian border, and from there to Tabriz and Tehran, in the hope that Iranian exports will flow from there too. So in the case of Iran, it was strategic reasons, no question about it, but also economic reasons. Turkey was a pretty poor country in the period between two world wars. Its industrial base was very limited. So if it could tap into the trade relations between Iran and Iraq and Europe to become a transit route, this would have been very beneficial to it. And again, this is something that we see in the last few decades, Turkey becoming a transit route for exports, for various movements of merchandise, of trade between the Middle East and Central Asia and Europe. And you already see plans for it. It didn't work out, but plans for it in the period between the two world wars. So in the case of Iran, it was not only Syria, it was also issues of economic.
Okay, was independent secular Kemalist Republic an inspiring model for Middle East? Do you agree that?
There were many. There were definitely many people in the Middle East that looked at Turkey as an inspiring model. Now, for the most part, they did not necessarily. I mean, I don't recall coming across anybody who argues that that one should adopt the Kemalist modernization program wholesale. Usually, people would argue that specific aspects of it should be adopted. So, for some people, it was the kind of leadership that the Ghazi, that Mustafa Kemal appeared to offer. So they argue that we should adopt this form of leadership. For others, it was in the 1930s the economic nationalism that Turkey espoused, strong emphasis on nationalist emphasis on the local economy. So they wanted these types. For others, the form of Turkish feminism, state feminism, kind of feminism that perhaps today looks. I mean, today we look at it and we see some drawbacks of it, but in the 30s it looked very progressive and definitely leading feminists in Egypt, for instance, but in other places in the Middle East as well, time and again argued we should follow the Turkish example in adopting these reforms. It could have been, for some people, calling for the militarization of society, bringing military forms into the schools, various types, and surprisingly, sometimes it were people who were pro-democracy. So obviously, Turkey was not a democracy in the 1930s. So people who were, nevertheless, people who were pro-democracy in the Middle East would argue, well, we should adopt their type of feminism or things like that. And people who were opposed to democracy could have supported Turkey just as well, arguing, well, we shouldn't have democracy. We should have a situation like in Turkey in which we have only one strong party that can project the will of the people and move the country forward. So it's not as if people on this specific political agendas or various goals supported Turkey. It's people from different parts of the political map in the Middle East that wanted to adopt specific aspects of the Kemalist agenda, not wholesale. And the government officials in Turkey were very aware of that, and they actually tried to encourage it. They tried to encourage a positive image of Turkey in the Middle East, both in order to dispel various criticisms of Turkey, because there were also critical voices in the Middle East against Turkey. So in order to dispel them, but also for various strategic economic reasons that I can talk about later on, it appeared beneficial to try to cultivate support in the Middle East to Turkey, to try to promote a positive image of Turkey in places like Egypt or Iraq.
Okay, my last question is your book going to publish in Turkish, translate to Turkish?
Well, my first book was translated to Turkish and was published. So hopefully there is a publisher out there that can contact me or Cambridge University Press that published the book. And I would love this book to be translated and published in Turkish. I would love for the Turkish public, for Turkish scholars. I mean, most of them, I guess, read English, but some might find it more comfortable to read Turkish. It's probably going to be cheaper, the book published in Turkey, so definitely I would welcome it very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. B.
Thank you very much.
In our exclusive interview, we talked with Dr. Amit Beam from Clemson University. He told his book, Kemalist Turkey and the Middle East.